Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hi, I'm Dalip Singh from Hindu Business Line. For this edition of podcast, we have with us Lt Gen AK Bhatt, retired, the Director General of the Indian Space Association, an apex industry body created to be the collective voice of the Indian space industry. General Bhatt, who has held top leadership and management positions in the Indian Army, will talk us about growing militarization of space and India's response towards that. Defense space will play an increasingly defining role to sustain and secure India's rising global stature. Though India's space intervention has been largely civilian, in the recent past, government has been putting its act together on this aspect of future warfare, which is visible in Defense Space Vision 2020 document. To serve the military needs, India is integrating its space capabilities, realizing that growing dependence on space also brings along with it vulnerabilities. The government has taken steps including launching several communication and surveillance satellites, and more are in the offing, and it has already demonstrated in March 2019 that it possesses an anti-satellite missile capabilities. But cyber threat challenges demand much more. The global space industry is projected to be worth around $1.8 trillion by 2035, and Indian military industry is eyeing to get a pie in the new age technology trade. General Bhatt, we are happy to host you on our podcast. Let's begin our conversation. Sir, can you briefly describe what is defense space and increasing militarization of space for general consumption of our listeners?
Firstly, I should start at very beginning of exploration of space by human beings. Though human beings have been talking of space, and astronomy and astrology has been there for a very, very long time, actual forays into space only started during the end of the World War II. And the first rockets which went to space, the ballistic rockets, were the V2 rockets or the Vengeance 2 rockets made by Germany, which were to target capitals of the European ally countries, especially Britain. And from there, the space race started especially during the Cold War, the space race or the competition to have achievements in space, be it in launching the first satellite, be it in sending the first human being, or landing on moon. This race continued between Soviet Union and America. At that time, primarily space or assets in space were one, for national status, and two, to monitor the ballistic missile of each other. Other usages of space came up later. And now, in present times, very slowly the space started being used for strategic purposes. And what is space used today by spacefaring nations or for the large number of nations is, number one, for satellite communication. Number two, it is used for intelligence, surveillance, and recce, which basically means looking at the enemy, looking at his capabilities, his assets, where they are. And thirdly, for what we call is PNT, position, navigation, and timing. In simple words, for assistance in navigation, or for guiding weapons which are of long. Now, these are the three primary and basic use of military space. And usage of this, which is increased more and more, is being called as militarization. The other, of course, conventional use of space by the militaries is for meteorology, because checking the weather, knowing about the weather, and also ballistic missile guidance has always been the use. In recent times, what new usages have come is it is being used for marine domain awareness, because monitoring of the seas, monitoring of the ships in the seas, a lot of assistance for communication, for the identification systems which are being now put into ships, space is used. And the very recent uses now are space situational awareness, space domain awareness, and finally capabilities for space deterrence or space warfare. So this is what all the militarization of space is. But more importantly, communication, navigation, and ISR are what enhance the capabilities of the Army, Navy, and Air Force in any battle. This is what I would say is what the space is being used today by various armed forces of the world.
Does India have a clear roadmap for advancing India's space doctrine and capabilities?
Definitely. Firstly, the Indian armed forces definitely identify space and cyber as new domains of warfare, other than the three conventional ones which we all know about, that is the land, air, and the sea. In fact, one of the actions taken because space is a new domain of warfare was the creation of the Defense Space Agency, which started in 2018 and ultimately in 2019, the Indian Armed Forces made the Defense Space Agency to focus on controlling, planning for the future space capabilities which are supposed to be there. And later, this Defense Space Agency to become a space command under the IDS, that is the Indian Integrated Defense Staff of India. As I know, there is a document of India's space security doctrine. It is not in the open domain, but it is there at the highest level, nearly finalized. And as you are aware, last month itself, SPS-3, that is Satellite-Based Surveillance 3 program, was approved by the cabinet,
Right.
which requires more than 50 satellites to be made for the surveillance capability of the three services. So there is a clear, the fact that the DSA was made, the fact that these satellites have now been approved by the government and money released for it, the fact that 2 years back, the Prime Minister announced defense space challenges, which were primarily, it was giving an indication to the private sector as to what are the aspirations of the defense forces for the future in all domains, from launch on demand to surveillance capabilities to capability of swarm satellites and whatever in the future the three defense forces require, that has been defined as Space Defense Challenges 75, which were announced by the Prime Minister in Ahmedabad 2 years back.
Yeah, but in that context, yes, right, General Bhatt. I think last week, though tabletop, the Tri Services also carried out an exercise, but it also involves a whole of a nation approach to strategically approach defense space. So, can you throw some light on that?
So, firstly, one thing very important about space or interesting about space is that all technologies developed in space are dual. Be it communication, be it navigation, they are also used by the private sector. In fact, more and more usages in the private sector is now developed. Like I can give an example with your life also and my life. That early morning when you check the weather, you have used space. If you have moved from place A to place B, you have used Google, again you have used space. If you have taken out money from an ATM, you have used. If somebody in the far-flung areas in India would be checking the weather, deciding on when does he sow his next plants, the farmer is using space. So space is becoming all-encompassing in various civilian uses in India. And apart from it, the defense forces also require it to use for enhancing their capabilities to fight a war. So space today is a critical sector not only for security but also for enhancing your own economy or any developing country to move.
With strong adversaries as our neighbor like China, can you give us a comparative analysis of our strength versus theirs?
Firstly, I'll just put in perspective, and of course, whatever information I have is of open domain. What is claimed today in the world in terms of military satellites is the largest number is with USA, of course, nearing 250. And then is China with about 150 to 160 military satellites. And India, in comparison, has a figure of 10 to 12 of purely military satellites. This figure also is not announced. It is from various sources what the figure comes out with what we have in terms of cartosats or in terms of resats and whatever would be this figure. Now, I'll just give you certain figures from the open domain to compare what China has and what India has. In 2023, the total number of launch attempts by China was 67. There were 7 by India. The number of the total payload in tonnage sent by China was 178 tons, and India was 7.1 tons. A difference of 25 times. And in terms of satellites, India launched 14 satellites, China launched 210 satellites in 2020. The total number of assets of India in terms of satellites in 2023 is 58, while China has 490. I'm talking of military plus civilian satellites. There's a large difference because China is aspiring not to compete in space with India, but to compete with USA. And their concerns for ISR, for communication, for navigation are global. They want to protect and have a visibility in the first chain of islands and second chain of islands. And what they are aspiring for is a revisit time, which they've nearly achieved, is of 10 to 12 minutes. At any spot in their area of interest, they can see it in 10 to 12 minutes. They have a global GPS system, BEDU, which is functional all over the world with good accuracies. They aspire by 2027 to have 3,960 satellites of communication, which will go to 13,000 by 2035. So this is the aspirations of China, and it is nearly the way it has been carrying out launches in the last 3 to 4 years. They have the capacity and the capability to do. So there is, if you have to see purely in terms of total capabilities, they have a much larger number. But as far as India is developing capabilities, and the part of it is 52 satellites which have been ordered, and the communication satellites and other satellites we have looked at what do we require to protect them. And of course, these 52 satellites which are going to come, and also when we start using the assets for low Earth orbit communication also, we will have what the Indian Defence Forces require.
Okay, sir. What should be the response architecture to space threat? Right now we have Defence Space Agency as the nodal agency, and Indian Air Force also has ambitions for becoming Indian Aerospace Force. Is multiplicity of organization healthy?
As far as what you are saying of the Air Force, Indian Air Force becoming an Indian Aerospace Force, meaning that it looks after something which is below the Kamran line and across the Kamran line, that is in space. This is an aspiration of the Indian Air Force, but presently what the government has done, I'll talk of that. The DSA is a tri-service agency. However, the lead service for that is USA. Because I would very emphatically like to tell you that there is a large difference between the two domains in which the Air Force operates and the domain of space, which is beyond 100 kilometers. Because in that domain, the way satellites have to be powered or moving from place A to place B, it is an area of vacuum. There is no atmosphere. Whole spacecraft's movement and technology and everything is different. It's a different domain as such. And that is why USA has made a separate space force. Also, France has made it. It also had it under the Air Force. Now it has separated it as a separate French Space Command. But that would be the future. For the present, and which is being done in India, is we have created a tri-service defense space agency, but with the Air Force as the lead agency.
Right, sir. So the situation is evolving, you're suggesting, and things would take a shape later. It is imperative to enhance industrial military capabilities to meet future warfare demands, and that would be driven from the procurement interest from armed forces. How much of that is happening, given that funding is a major constraint?
So, it is definitely on the positive side. And the first example I may, at the cost of repetition, out of the 52 SBS-3 satellites, 30 or 32 satellites will be made by private. That itself is a step where, firstly, the government has faith in our private sector that they will be able to meet India's demand for ISR satellites. And also this will give an impetus for our private sector to be able to produce this for the armed forces and also have a capability which has global impact. Similarly, 75 defense challenges which I mentioned, which have aspects of making a satellite launcher for launch on demand, making communication satellites, making everything which is required in the different verticals of space. Those 75 defense challenges were projects where 1 crore to 10 crore, 25 crores will be given to private sector. And these challenges have been already given to private startup companies is an impetus to make this sector grow in the private sector, including startups, that they are able to meet the requirements of the armed forces as well as the nation.
So, satellite is one part of the sort of space defense armament. But if you can tell us what else sort of hardware and software the industry can look up to for manufacturing or for innovation to meet future demands.
So, like you very rightly said, it is just not satellites.
Yeah.
If it is a communication satellites, equally important is making the ground station. Equally important is interpreting that data, making it to an application which is useful for the defense. In all these sectors, private sector will also work along with the military. This is, I'm only talking of wires. Similarly, if it is communication, the devices which are required, satellite communication devices to be used on ground, they will need to be made by the private sector. Even in navigation, that is PNT, like we have a IRNSS system, a NAVIC system which we have of 7 satellites. That positioning data has to come. The receivers for that will have to be made and are being made now by the private sector. Not only for private usage, but also for military. Like so devices which will be connecting with the satellite, the applications which will interpret the data, as well as the satellite itself, all are dimensions where private sector will have to chip in along with this.
So coming to non-military threats in space, which stem mostly from natural factors. But we have seen the countries have evolved capabilities where they can weaponize weather. China, I believe, has one. I had reported some time back. What could be our sort of counter strategy for tackling such scenarios? Because many a times flash floods in Uttarakhand and elsewhere, you never know. That could be purely a natural phenomena or adversary has tweaked it. How do you differentiate between the two?
So firstly, I believe it's a natural phenomenon which has happened. But what you are implying is, can weather be used as a weapon?
Yeah. I'm saying it can happen tomorrow. I'm talking about tomorrow. How
So
and do we have capabilities whether to actually find out, decode it's a natural phenomena or it's a man-made?
So firstly, I would. The thing is, presently, is there any such capability? I'm not sure. I do not. But what capabilities are being developed, and I'll just give you an example of a startup in India, Digantara, which had made small, very small satellites to be put for weather monitoring in space. And what were they supposed to do? A large number of them monitoring the space across and giving in data of whatever. They are also working into debris detection and whatever is moving in space. So very, very important element of security in space is space situational awareness, knowing what all is in space. Because like you said, one threat which is there is from the weather, and the second threat is from adversaries' satellites, intentional or unintentional. Because there's a large number which is moving. There are more than 10,000 satellites as of today. And the second is a large number of debris. In fact, debris is the larger threat today to any space assets of any country. There are more than 36 lakh debris which are of a size of more than 10 centimeters. And if you come to smaller debris also, the number is in a million, more than a million. All these are threats to our assets. And for that, what is most important is space situational awareness. That is knowing where are our satellites, where are other people's satellites, that by accidentally we do not crash with it. And secondly, also knowing any satellite which can be a threat to our assets. So capability for this is being developed by ISRO as well as in the private sector. Of course, any one nation today, except maybe America or in a few years China, has the capability to do space situational awareness on its own. Hence, countries are collaborating with each other. And collaboration is required because nobody wants an accidental clashing of satellites with anybody else's. So there's a system in place like today also. If two satellites come too close to each other or likely to come too close to each other in the next 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, information is exchanged and then the satellites move away from each other to avoid each other. Now, largest part of this data today is being provided by US to the world. And Chinese also have their own system, but I don't think so they're sharing it. But there is a requirement of global cooperation between nations which are and think that they have to operate in space together. And what I'm talking of the spacefaring nation is USA, France, Japan, and others. But apart from that, we have to have a capability to be able to know where our own assets are and if there is a danger or threat to our assets. Now, as far as kinetic weapons, this is the defensive measure I've talked of. The kinetic weapons, there can be weapons which are kinetic or non-kinetic. By non-kinetic, I mean directed energy weapons. It can be laser dazzlers. It can be jammers. It can also be kinetic weapons like the ASAT weapon, that is the direct ascent anti-satellite weapon, a test of which was done by very few nations have that capability, that is USA, China, and India also. But that is, of course, a kinetic one and should only be used. The other is which nations are developing are spy and kamikaze satellites. And kamikaze satellites or proximity satellites are the satellites which is the enemy satellite which comes close to your own satellite and then blasts off to kill your satellite.
What lessons India can draw from Ukraine's use of Starlink satellite service in war against Russia?
Russian-Ukraine war has brought 2-3 distinct lessons. And first lesson was that Russia started the war by attacking the space assets of the West. And as you are aware, they had attacked and destroyed VSAT terminals which were there, which broke down Ukraine's entire communication. And of course, Europe also.
Right.
But a new dimension has come after the Russian-Ukraine war, and that is of private players providing space-based capabilities for communication as well as for ISR. We are all aware that SpaceX Starlink provided satellite terminals 2000 plus and even more later, which restored Ukraine's communication capability. In fact, the total info system and the communication system of Ukraine, which had been attacked by Russia, was brought back to shape and operated with satellites, with the Starlink constellation, which is a private constellation of Elon Musk. Similarly, a lot of information on ISR, which gave Ukraine an advantage, was provided by private commercial players. Nobody owns it up, but companies like Maxar, Planet M, and even Hawkeye, I believe, have provided data, ISR information, which has helped Ukraine to have a better insight into what operations were happening there. So the new dimension now has come is war may start by your assets being attacked, your communication and other assets being attacked in the very beginning of the war. And the second is that private commercial players will be providing facilities for communication and ISR. These are two very distinct lessons which have come from the war.
Military threats to space assets can be through cyber, anti-satellite weapons, weaponized satellite operations, SATCOM jamming and others. How well are we prepared to secure our space assets?
I'm very sure, and of course, I am not in the decision making, but what I can make out and I can very clearly make out is, say for communication. Presently, we have 2 to 3 satellites in the geo orbit, that is the geosynchronous orbit. We all know Rukmani is for the Navy, then there's the Air Force satellite, and there is the Army satellite which is being made. Though these nomenclatures of Air Force, Navy, and Army satellite would be wrong because these transponders are used by all the 3 services. But we are depending on 1/2/3 assets. What lesson and which definitely the armed forces are going into now is looking at having low Earth orbit constellation where you have a larger number of satellites and destruction or jamming of one satellite will not disturb your communication. That said, let me tell you one thing, that jamming in space is very difficult because if the orbit is in the low Earth orbit, There are so many large number of satellites, like the Starlink constellation is of more than 6,000 satellites. How many can you jam? And if it is in the geo, it is so far away that the power you would require to jam a satellite firstly would be would be in a very high power, which is not possible. And if at all it is possible, also you can only do it intermittently. You cannot continuously. But that said, these lessons of having multiple alternatives for communication, for ISR, and not depending on only few assets is a lesson which definitely has been picked up by the armed forces. And that is why we have this constellation of 52 satellites coming, and also something being done for low Earth observation, a low Earth LEO constellation for communication. And as you are aware, ASAT capability and development of non-kinetic weapons must be going on. There are no declared intents, but I'm very sure this is being done by the armed forces.
Sir, I think we'll have to wind up our conversation. Nevertheless, thanks for sharing insights into space defense. But India, as you yourself acknowledged, needs to catch up fast on space defense. Perhaps we'll get some other time to hear more from you on this evolving issue. Bye for now, sir.
It's been a pleasure to be there with you, and we'll continue meeting. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir.